Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. To acknowledge Jim's family, friends and staff in the chamber today as I rise to make some comments on this motion. In Jim's maiden speech, he talked about the words of Napoleon that said, if you want to understand a country's interests, go and look at the graves of its soldiers. And it struck me yesterday as we were at the Australian War Memorial for the last post, how appropriate those words were. On the one hand, we were there to remember the life of Lieutenant Stanley Lefebvre, but as we stood and I looked around the gallery and I saw the numbers of campaigns that Australians have been involved with, it brought back memories of Jim and his service and the numbers of places he has served our nation. As we heard words from the Prime Minister talking about service and sacrifice, but also looking beyond the servicemen to the families who were left with a void, it brought me back to Jim and what you and your family are going through. As the Leader of the Opposition spoke about the importance of democracy and freedom and being prepared to stand up and fight and be prepared to defend and promote those things that enable us to be the nation that we are, it brought back to mind all the things that Jim stood for. Again, in his maiden speech, he was kind enough to mention the fact that Senator Reynolds and myself had been the two people he had asked to escort him into the chamber. Not that at that time I knew Jim well. We'd both graduated from Duntroon, we'd had a career in the military, we were both Army pilots, but that was the first time I'd started to have a direct interaction with Jim in a professional capacity. It did, however, give me the advantage of having been in those three institutions to understand their mottos and their ethos and to see it so fully lived out. In a time when so many companies have vision statements and values and people give lip service to things, it's good to reflect on the values that the Army has. Service, they define as the selflessness of character to place the security and interests of the nation and its people ahead of our own, of courage, respect, integrity and excellence, all of which we saw in Jim. At Duntroon, the motto was learning promotes strength. And if there's one thing that I knew about Jim from his time here and at his funeral, were the comments about his appetite for learning, for understanding, and how that not only made him strong but made his contributions more powerful to this nation. And the Australian Army Aviation Corps, its motto is vigilance. And we see in Jim's contributions his vigilance, his care for this nation, for his family, and the fact that no effort was too much to help people be prepared. So across the roles people have talked about here today, soldier, senator, parliamentarian, patriot, advocate, aviator, I've seen Jim work. We worked together on the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, and I've seen the detail of his work, his inquisitive nature, his willingness to challenge. Having sat in on Cabinet Office policy committees with Jim as we worked with leaders at the highest level in the nation to try and explain and advocate for the importance, in Jim's case, of things like a national security strategy, I've seen the diligence, the respect, but also the passion with which he has approached these issues. I've had Jim's visit in South Australia in my paired seat of MAJGEN and seen his advocacy, his ability to interact with veterans and then to advocate for them powerfully back in this place. On the international stage, we've heard a lot about Jim and his advocacy here, but one of the groups he was involved with was the high-level military group, which advocated for the rule of law, which sought to understand and to highlight the fact that not all governments, not all societies actually share the same values, about the fact that whilst we, for example, are governed by the rules of armed conflict, there are nations which are authoritarian in nature which will seek to use those things to our detriment. And Jim is the first to admit that he's had his critics along the way, but he was happy to have the critics where he was standing up for something that mattered. And so the report they issued, for example, around Israel and some of Israel's military conflicts, where, in his words, Israel demonstrated that they had standards for their defence force in terms of adherence to the rules of armed conflict that matched, if not exceeded, those of our own, earned him many critics. But it's an example of where he was prepared to put himself forward to advocate for the values that he believed were important. As an aviator, he served in 171 Squadron, as I did, but he was the honorary colonel for the Aviation Corps, and in his words, it was like being the tribal elder. And as I think of Jim's role here in this place, to some extent that's the role he played here. The tribal elder is not necessarily someone who has executive power, but the tribal elder is someone who brings a lot of wisdom, of experience, insight and discernment and encouragement. And that's what we saw him bring to the national policy debate, to colleagues in this place. There's another aspect to his character that I don't think a lot of people would use to describe Jim. We've heard about his stature, about his leadership, about his ability to command. But I would say Jim had a large dose of humility, which is not something you often associate with senior leaders, whether in politics or in the military. But Jim was humble enough to not only join a local RFS and get on the tools and work, but he was humble enough to learn from people. He was humble enough to relate to people regardless of their stature. As we see his ability to interact not only with community here, but also professionally with people on all sides of politics, internationally, the relationships he built with the TNI in Indonesia and others, speaks volume of the fact that he saw people, he respected people. And the fact that so many people here have seen Jim as a friend speaks to the fact that he respected people and he had the humility to value them and to value the time that he spent with them. I'd like to finish by returning to the Australian War Memorial. In the midst of the pomp and ceremony of the Federation Guard, of the fine speeches, of the laying of wreaths and all the things that were going on, we were interrupted incessantly by the beating rotors of firefighting helicopters flying overhead. And I thought Jim would think this was fantastic. I can imagine him being far more interested in where they were going, what loads they were carrying, whether they were achieving their mission, than he was in the pomp and ceremony. And so I thought that last post-ceremony summed up so much of what was great about Jim. Vale, Jim Molan.